And we are live. As it is Friday, we have with us Dr. Leif Knutsen, PhD, as per usual. And now we also have special guest Jonathan Conricus, Senior Fellow at FDD, and also former IDF spokesperson. Good morning, Jonathan. How are you?
Good morning. I'm
Good morning.
great, as good as can be. Happy to be here. Good morning, Leif.
Good morning. So are you in Israel? It's really afternoon for you then, right? Just barely.
Yeah, here we're 4 minutes past noon, but for you guys,
Yeah.
it's still morning. So,
It's still morning. Barely. Yeah.
So I see you're very active, Jonathan. You're traveling all over. You're speaking on everything like Piers Morgan a lot of the time, and still doing a lot of stuff. It seems like in practice you're now like more formally IDF spokesperson than former. Like I see you more than any other spokesperson. It's great that you're doing this, but how can you keep up with everything? How do you have the energy?
yeah, thank you. I hope I would have wanted to do more. I would have wanted to be on CNN and BBC and Sky and Swedish TV and Norwegian TV and many other places to do more, to speak more on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people, but they're not so interested in having me. So you can see me on alternate places, social media. You mentioned Piers and other debate shows as well in order to get that message out. And I can only regret that a lot of traditional media have I don't know if there's any official sanction or some decree that says don't have Jonathan Conricus on, but it sure feels like it, because even though I have, I think, relevant information and analysis about the situation, whenever I suggest that to big networks, they for some reason are not interested. So I have no problem, doing this for as long as it takes, because I think this is the most important fight on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people, and actually also Western civilization. The battle of the narratives, the clash between Western Judeo-Christian values of democracy, freedom, human rights, human liberties is on one side and represented in the Middle East by Israel. And then on the other side are the forces of theocracy and Islamism. And Israel is fighting a battle for its own survival, but it's also indirectly fighting an indirect battle to help the West preserve itself. Many Europeans and Westerners sadly don't understand that, and many of them are fooled into believing the other side's narrative. And therefore, I see it as a mission of mine to keep on fighting that fight and trying to represent and present facts and analysis and perspective that a lot of people otherwise don't get.
We're so thankful that you're doing that as well, because if there's one thing that we need in this situation, it's information. And it's great to have it from a person such as yourself, since you have so many years of background, also background from being on the ground, right? Boots on the ground with Israel, with the IDF. Could you mention for perhaps new viewers what your background is with your experience in Israel and IDF and everything?
Yeah, thank you. It's a bit of a mixed background. I started my service almost 30 years ago as a combat soldier, and I fought on the ground against Hezbollah in Lebanon and against Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other terror organizations in Gaza. I've served as a platoon commander, as a company commander, with around 7, 10 years of combat experience in the IDF, leading troops in battle. And then I shifted to do more diplomacy and talking and softer stuff. I liaised with UN peacekeeping forces, UNIFIL in southern Lebanon and UNDOF on the Golan Heights. I did that for around 5 or so years. And then I was the first Israeli officer to be seconded, basically on loan from the State of Israel, from IDF to the UN. I was the first Israeli officer to serve at UN headquarters in New York at the Office of Military Affairs, Department of Peacekeeping, where I had a very interesting 3 years. I worked in an assessment team. Assessment is UN language for intelligence. And my job was to analyze the strategic situation in various areas of the world where the UN has peacekeeping forces. I focused on the Horn of Africa, Somalia, in that area, and also on Western Africa, Sahara, Western Sahara, and also the general Sahel area, dealing with the various Islamist organizations there as well. So that gave me very interesting perspective. And the last assignment I did in the IDF was international spokesperson for 4 years between 2017 and 2021. What that brings me is experience on the ground, actual soldiering, fighting, leading soldiers in combat against real enemies, a lot of experience on the ground in general security operations up north, Lebanese border, and in the south. And then as a spokesperson, you get that kind of strategic perspective when you are the face and voice of the IDF to the world, dealing with hundreds of journalists that are permanently positioned in Israel, reporting on the situation in regular times, and then, of course, at peak levels when there are thousands of international journalists and media in Israel. For instance, the little war that we had, 11 days of fighting in May 21, I was spokesperson then. And for the first 3 months of the war, I was, as a reserve officer, served in the IDF spokesperson unit as a spokesperson, did hundreds of interviews in main international networks. And since then, senior fellow at FDD, which is an American think tank that focuses on US foreign policy and national strength. I focus on different terrorist organizations, the Iranian axis of terror around Israel, Sunni terrorist organizations, and also now, more of lately, the Muslim Brotherhood.
Could you give us, let's start with, we're going to talk later about the Amnesty report, which is a newly released report on October 7th from Amnesty International. But I thought first, could you give us an overview of what's going on right now as pertains to Israel, in Gaza, and Syria? Perhaps what is the most pressing concerns for Israel right now when it comes to its borders and security?
Well, to begin with, I would say that there is a lot of unfinished business. Israel has done a lot of progress over the years. We started at a horrible starting point on October 7. We were surprised. We were humiliated. We allowed our enemies to kill, torture, abduct, humiliate our people, our citizens, which is the worst sin that any country can perpetrate. And that's a horrible thing to try to recover from. But from that low point of October 7, we have fought our way against various enemies on 7 fronts. And today, when you look at the situation around us, militarily speaking, I'm not speaking diplomatically and in global politics, but militarily speaking, the situation is much better than it was on October 7. But I cannot say that in any of the different fronts, not in Lebanon with Hezbollah, not in Syria, not in Iran, which is further away, the Islamic Republic of Iran, or with the Houthis in Yemen, or in Gaza. I cannot say that in any of those frontiers there's, business has been concluded and that the enemies have been defeated. We've made progress, but there's unfinished business wherever we look. The unfinished business in Gaza is that Hamas is still in place. The UN Security Council adopted the resolution according to the Trump plan, but it is not being implemented. We can see that the Americans, the administration, and the bureaucracy, the CENTCOM, Central Command, they are definitely vested in it, and they are trying to field an international security force, which is supposed to take over from the IDF and then be the bridge, the interim bridge between IDF and then ultimately Palestinian self-governance in Gaza. So far, that's not happening. Hamas is not being dismantled from their weapons, and Hamas is not relinquishing control over the Gaza Strip in violation of the UN Security Council resolution and contrary to what the presidential peace plan is about. And every day that goes by is another day that Hamas continues to solidify its control over the Gaza Strip, and Palestinians suffer in Gaza. Now it's raining here in the region, and when it rains, the people who are exposed they suffer more. And I can assure you, Hamas families are not exposed out in the rain, but poor, unaffiliated Palestinians are exposed and are suffering. And then, of course, Hamas uses them as tools for propaganda in order to show how horrible the situation is. But in Gaza, unfinished business, and every day that goes by is a day that is wasted in terms of building the future for Gaza and changing that trajectory. And sadly, we have very strong forces that are opposing positive developments. The first one, of course, Hamas itself, but they are supported by Qatar, by Turkey, and by Egypt. And basically, what we have now is this kind of balancing act where we have the US in the middle, Israel on one side, and then Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey strongly supporting Hamas on the other side. And now it's kind of a tug of war or a type of a strength contest between the different sides, where the US will have to decide which part will have the upper hand or the final say. And I'm not entirely optimistic that things are going in the correct direction. So that's Gaza. In Syria, we have a jihadist in suit who is now the newly, not elected, but he's the de facto ruler of Syria, with a lot of hostile statements, with a lot of marches on the streets by Syrian security organizations, their military, internal security forces, where they are openly threatening Israel, threatening to march on Jerusalem, vowing to avenge whatever grievances they have in blood, and openly threatening Israel and saying that it is only a matter of time before they will have the ability to actually attack Israel. On the positive side, there's US pressure and involvement to make some kind of a security deal between Israel and Syria. That has been in the works for many months, but it has not yet come to fruition. If you ask me what's the delay, I would say that the basic issue here is trust, and that Israel at this stage does not feel that it can trust a newly minted politician who for 25 years was a jihadi terrorist who murdered anybody who he could get his hands on who was not aligned with his ideological perspective. I'm of course speaking about Al-Julani, or Ahmad Ashara, as he now prefers to be called. So a sensitive situation. Israel is still forward deployed inside Syria, creating a bigger buffer zone between where Israeli civilians are and where jihadi units can come close. And Israel is creating that buffer to make it more difficult for jihadi terrorists to attack Israeli civilians. And it's an unstable situation. I hope that we will be able to reach some kind of political agreement with US assurances to demilitarize southwestern Syria, basically from Damascus to the Israeli border, and provide security assurances for minorities in Syria, the Druze, the Kurds, and I don't care so much about the Alawites, but the Druze and the Kurds are, I think, very important, small and exposed ethnic minorities, Christians as well, that need to be protected. I hope we can reach that, but I'm not entirely sure that we will.
The situation in Sweden in particular, I've had two girls here that live in Norway that are Druze, Selena and Yara Zenedine, who speaks about what's happening in Sweden and the actual genocide that happened there. For all the talk about the Western world claiming genocide in Gaza, and nobody is actually speaking about Sweden, where these forces of Ahmed al-Shara stormed in and killed a lot of Druze people. And from what I understand, IDF is actually protecting that city now from these terrorists. Is that true? And what is the situation there?
Yeah, cynically, I can say, no Jews, no news. If someone is murdering someone in the Middle East or in Africa, in Somalia or in Sudan or other places, or in Syria, maybe someone will take notice. But if one Palestinian is hurt by an Israeli retaliation against a terrorist attack, that becomes headline news, and it's a number one item in Norwegian TV or Swedish TV or on the BBC. Sadly, that's the hypocrisy of the situation, and human suffering is not equal. And when Druze civilians, women and children are slaughtered by Sunni jihadists in Syria with government backing. It isn't really interesting because it only became interesting once Israel got involved and Israel bombed the defense ministry in Damascus in order to get them to stop and say, and Israel basically said, we do not agree and we are not going to allow you to slaughter these Druze innocent civilians because we care about them, because there are Druze in Israel who are directly related to them. And therefore, we are calling on you to stop that violence. And that effectively, I think, saved thousands of lives. Will Israel get a Nobel Peace Prize for protecting innocent civilians in Syria? I won't hold my breath for the next meetings of the Nobel Prize Committee in Oslo, but I don't think so. But bottom line here is that the situation is very tense. And yes, that was an attempted genocide, or at least genocidal intent by the Sunnis, by the Bedouins, and by the Syrian government who were attacking the Druze. And there are still Druze women and children missing. I know from first-hand encounters with Israeli Druze who have told me of still missing bodies, abducted women specifically, that were taken by these jihadi terrorist organizations and used as sex slaves and for other similar purposes. We know that happened by ISIS and other jihadi organizations with the Yazidis a few years ago in Iraq and specifically in Syria. And it's very similar to what happened with some, unfortunately, Druze young women who were taken hostage by these forces. So that is one of the reasons this type of atrocities, this mindset that we see with Syrian jihadi forces that now are Syrian government forces, that is one of the reasons why I think Israel is delaying any type of real signing here. Because we're not confident that we're dealing with an organization and people that are actually worthy of signing an agreement with, because they just perpetrated these horrible genocidal activities against innocent civilians, their own civilians in Sweden. So Israel is very cautious here, and I hope that Druze civilians in Syria will be offered that protection. It's difficult for Israel to provide that protection because if you look at the map, then it's about 70 kilometers between the Israeli border on the Golan and Sweda, which is where approximately 300,000, between 250 and 300,000 Druze Syrians live. And it's a lot of land in between, and there's no land connection and bridge. So Israel can provide temporary protection with Air Force and with political means and perhaps a few other ways to deliver fire, but really to defend the Druze, Israel doesn't really have that capacity, and I don't think that Israel will launch a full invasion into Syria in order to protect the Druze, only using aerial assets. So it's a complex situation. I'm happy that there's less attacks by Syrian forces against the Druze now, but it's definitely an unsettled situation.
So, Jonathan, one thing that occurs to me is that in discussing both sort of the frontier against Syria and the frontier against Gaza, which we need to think of them that way because these are war front lines still, unfortunately. You're kind of pessimistic, but at the same time, Israel has proven its military capability more than any other time. I mean, there's talk of Israel being a regional superpower and having military capabilities that are comparable to any countries in the world. So what do your pessimism, what do you see as possible scenarios if things don't go as we're hopeful they will on both those fronts? But, we also have Lebanon and Iran and Yemen for that matter. And then the broader sort of diplomatic information war that, you're heavily involved with. What's the
Leif,
pessimism, the optimism?
Yeah. Leif, I mean, you're right that Israel has accomplished a few things militarily and that it has shown that even though we were, complacent, probably arrogant, and we were asleep behind the wheel before October 7, now when we woke up, we've been able to rally and to fight, defend ourselves, and indeed deliver a lot of damage to our enemies. But I don't think that there's any room to be, the job isn't finished by a long margin. And my biggest concern here is that there's a lot of disparity between the level of military accomplishments, which, as you indicate, and I agree, it's pretty high, and Israel has done some pretty remarkable achievements on the battlefield against our main enemy, the Islamic Republic of Iran, against our closest and most dangerous enemy, Hezbollah, which was a very menacing threat against Israeli civilians before October 7, against the situation in Syria, against the Houthis to a certain extent, and very importantly, against Hamas. But these military achievements are not complemented by political agreements that solidify those military achievements and turn them into long-term, really situational changes. And we're still in the realm where we're operating more in the military realm than in achieving diplomatic long-term changes. And I want us to move from basically turning or changing military achievements into political achievements, and that has not happened yet. There's been good progress in Lebanon. The Lebanese government, out of its own interest, started a process a few months ago, 7-8 months ago, of actually disarming Hezbollah, of doing something that for our Scandinavian listeners will seem very obvious, that, well, the state has the monopoly on the use of force in the country. In Lebanon, that has never been the reality. And what the Lebanese state is now doing is collecting weapons from Hezbollah, from Palestinian terror organizations, and from other rogue non-governmental organizations, and saying the use of force is only in the hands of the government institutions, the military and police, because we are the ones who are supposed to have the authority to decide when and where we use force, when and where we use anything hostile against any of our neighbors, because then that will come with consequences. Up until now, Hezbollah was inside Lebanon, and they took orders from Tehran, not from Beirut. And they were using foreign money, foreign weapons, and foreign investment, and they were bringing trouble and destruction into Lebanon, acting as a foreign agent. And for the first time in their history, the Lebanese government has now finally summoned some of the political courage to say, okay, we don't want this situation anymore, and we are trying to retake or to take control over our country. They did some progress, but now they look as if they've run out of steam, political will, or military capability, or whatever it is. And they've done some cosmetic work when it comes to Hezbollah. But today, Hezbollah, Naim Qassem, their Secretary General, the guy who replaced the replacement of Hassan Nasrallah, because Hassan Nasrallah and his successor were both eliminated by Israel, Naim Qassem says, we are not going to disarm. And that is a problem for the state of Lebanon, because it ensures that there will be future fighting, and that the Iranians, again, will use Lebanon as a launch pad to launch attacks against Israel, and the destruction will be paid in Lebanese currency by Lebanese civilians and the Lebanese state, not by the Iranians, if the Iranians can get away with their strategy. So if you ask me, out of all of these different fronts, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, further away, Iran, my assessment is that the likelihood of Israel taking action in order to help bring a political process to advance it in the right direction, I think, even though it is definitely needed in Gaza, because Hamas is still in power, and because we don't see the international community with enough political will to actually do the heavy lifting, even though it's needed in Gaza, I think that the chances for Israel taking preemptive military action are the highest when it comes to Hezbollah in Lebanon. That is where I think we are the closest to returning to hostilities. Now, very important to emphasize, and with this I will end this my answer. It's a bit long, and I apologize, but very important to emphasize is that this isn't because Israel wants war. Israelis are pretty tired of war. We've definitely had enough, and we've paid a very heavy price. More than 2,000 Israelis have been killed over the last year. More than 20,000 service members from the different security organizations have been wounded, some of them very heavily wounded, suffering from long-term both psychological and physical consequences. And it's a drain on Israel's economy, on everything. Having said that, Israelis also understand that if we don't finish the job, nobody else is going to finish the job for us, and that we have to finish it now. Otherwise, the future generations will have to deal with similar things, and we don't want that. We had one October 7, and that's more than enough. And we don't want to find ourselves in a similar situation in the future again.
Because this is the sort of the mood shift that I think I've noticed, and you seem to be confirming it, which is that this strategy that was until October 7th of kicking the can down the road, as they kept saying, you know, postponing the issue in hope that things would resolve themselves in some different way, that phase is over, you know. That Israel, and I think the US is on board with this too, and I think secretly a lot of European countries are, is like, no, now we're done kicking the can down the road. We need to resolve this and put pressure, military pressure, to parties to come to the table and negotiate in good faith and with realistic safeguards, political solutions, as you were talking about. And if that doesn't happen now, then we'll apply more pressure until it happens. And if necessary, you know, start a new war and, you know, wipe out Hezbollah one more time. And if necessary, also be more aggressive militarily in Gaza to disarm Hamas if nobody else wants to do it. Am I on the right path here in thinking that that is what we're looking at?
I think you reflect reality very accurately, and I would only add one part to it. You said Israel, Americans, and Europeans. I don't know so much about Europeans. They're, in my mind, still very weak, and still most countries have not woken up and smelled the hummus. You know, they don't really smell the situation, and they don't understand where they are and what the threats to European civilization is. But in the local context, I think very important also to emphasize that Israel is doing the dirty work for the so-called moderate Arab countries. Had it not been for Israel, Lebanon would have gone under, and it would have become a complete vassal state of the Iranian Empire. Had it not been for Israel, and to a certain extent the US, Jordan would have faced a similar fate. And had it not been for Israel, the Bashar al-Assad regime would still govern Syria, and the Iranians would be controlling it. Syrians today may have a better future, and they may have a better path to prosperity, maybe civil rights, even though I'm not so sure that this regime will provide it. But there's a chance for that, thanks to the fact that Israel weakened Hezbollah, weakened Iran, and allowed jihadi forces, HTS, to actually take over Syria and oust the dictator. And last point, in Lebanon, the Lebanese government, even though they are outwardly sour towards Israel and, of course, not positive, inwards and in closed-door meetings, and I know this from very good sources, they're not only positive and supporting Israeli threats and actions against Hezbollah, they're asking for it because they know that the only guys in the neighborhood that are strong enough, brave enough, and have the equipment, and most importantly, the political will to do so is Israel. And they're asking Israel to do the dirty work for them, because otherwise, who else will disarm a powerful Iranian militia that has grown like a cancer inside Lebanese society and taken control over southern Lebanon? Who can do it but Israel? I would want the Lebanese government to be sovereign and to do it by themselves, but sadly, they've proven that they're not capable. And I don't want Israeli soldiers to be exposed to threat, and I don't need, you know, additional condemnations and criticism of Israel for, again, taking preemptive measures against an enemy. But as you said very correctly, the mindset has shifted. And to summarize it, Israel, I think, is now much more clear-eyed about the future, and we're not going to allow hostile intent and hostile capabilities coincide along our borders in the hands of our enemies and allow them, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, Iranians, whatever, or what other abomination will come, we're not going to allow them to have the ability to choose when and where to attack. If we see enemy intentions coupled with enemy capabilities, we strike. We use our intel, we use our air force, and we use our preemptive measures in order to strike and take those out of the equation before they will try to repeat what Hamas did on October 7 or anything else that might be even worse.
What do you think
This-
about?
my-
Yeah, go ahead, Leif.
Yeah, my only thought about the Europeans, and I don't know if I'm more or less cynical than you, but I think a lot of the leaders in Europe know very well what's going on, but they just can't muster the domestic political capital to openly support it. So they're playing a back channel game of either explicitly or tacitly accepting what Israel does, but publicly condemning it and even undermining it. I think it's I think we have a bit of a political crisis in Europe in that we don't have leaders who are able to say, look, we need to do things that are unpleasant, that are uncomfortable, that are even risky. But the alternative is worse. We're just not there yet.
No, I don't think. I think you're 100% right. That is the biggest issue, and having the moral courage to actually define the problem. It's like, a lot of, if you put blindfolded people into a room with an elephant and each person gets to feel the elephant and they try to describe it without knowing what it is, that's a similar situation. They're all describing different parts of the same entity, but nobody is able to take the blindfold off, take a step back and say, oh, it's a big green elephant and it's threatening to take over our lives, our institutions, our countries. It's threatening to erase our culture, our legal system, our democracy, our type of governance, our welfare systems. It's threatening to do all that. But at this stage, and as you, Leif, say, the really issue here is political courage and leadership with the ability to say, well, I don't like this. This isn't what our grandfathers and many generations before fought for. This isn't what Europe is about, and this must change. And to take hard action, which at some times the action that is needed will be contrary to some of the underpinnings of democracy. But this is a democracy or a democratic society that needs to fight for its survival. And it needs to choose, are we going to sacrifice a little bit of the margins of the current limitations in order to save our system? Or are we going to say that we prefer to keep the system whole and then allow an external threat that currently is growing in Europe to actually take over and become dominant? When you look at the situation in Belgium, in the UK, to a certain extent in Sweden, and in a few other places, it is extremely severe, and it is maybe one generation away from takeover. And if urgent political action isn't taken, that is where we will find ourselves. And I don't agree with everything that President Trump says, but when he speaks about, that Europeans are, that they need to wake up and understand that they face an attack, he's not speaking about Russia. He's speaking about this generational internal threat of Islamist takeover. He's still not saying it exactly in those words, but when he speaks about immigration, when he speaks about unchecked political activity in European countries, that is what he refers to. And on this point, I agree.
These jihadis that are forming up in Syria and threatening to go towards Israel, do you think that would happen? Do you think they're crazy enough to do that? And if so, what will they meet in Israel, do you think?
Now, at this stage, it doesn't look as if they are intent on doing that. It doesn't look as if they think that it is the good timing to do. And I think that when they raise their binoculars and look at Israel, they see a country with a military that is on high readiness and high alert. And basically what Israel is signaling is, just give me an excuse and I will send you your 72 virgins. So I don't think that they think it's a good time to attack Israel. Probably thanks to Israel's actions, preemptive action, taking out strategic weapons in Syria, striking a lot of their important R&D facilities, but also creating that additional buffer zone and then messaging clearly, don't mess with us. We understand that you want to, but if you will, it'll cost you dearly. But the real challenge will be, how can Israel then maintain this posture, this understanding, and this level of vigilance in 1 year, 2 year, 5 years? And of course, lessons of history are very relevant here, because many years ago we were vigilant along the border with Gaza. But then we started telling ourselves stories about how Hamas was deterred, and how Hamas wasn't seeking confrontation, and how Hamas had gone from a jihadi organization to just a governing organization, and how Hamas was now much more concerned about welfare, infrastructure, and the quality of living for Palestinians, which of course was 100% wrong. It was a result of deception by the Hamas and willful self-deception by Israel. And that's, of course, something that can happen in the future with the Syrians. And of course, there are many parallels between what Hamas was and then the kind of picture that they portray towards Israel and towards the West, what Al-Qaeda and Jabhat al-Nusra and HTS were before in Syria, and what they are now, and what kind of image they're portraying to the world. There are many similarities here.
Just a final question before we go into the Amnesty report. I have a viewer question here from Arvid, who asks about, what about Turkey in Syria and possibly in Gaza? What do you think about that? Is Turkey a wild card, Jonathan?
I thank the gentleman for his question. No, I don't think Turkey is a wild card. Turkey is a potential enemy of Israel. It's just one short bit away from becoming a real enemy, an outspoken and officially designated enemy. In my perspective, Turkey is on a war footing. They have imperialistic, expansionist designs and desires over the region. Many parts of the current Turkish leadership dream of reinstituting the Ottoman Empire in this area of the world. And if you listen to read between the lines, but also listen to speeches made in Turkish, you'll hear that, we used to govern this for 400 years. It was part of our land. It was part of the caliphate, and it should be so in the future again. And we're going to make it part of the Turkish Empire again. This isn't things that I'm making up. And when you couple that kind of mindset with Turkey being an outspoken supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, with Turkey being a facilitator for Hamas and other terror organizations, financial facilitator and military facilitator for Hamas, and with Turkey's extreme hostility, diplomatic hostility towards Israel, which is evident in every fora and every front. When you couple all of those things together with Turkish economic capabilities, and most importantly, their current military capabilities, you get a very dangerous cocktail, a cocktail that is combustible. And my assessment, when we look a few years into the future, sadly, I can definitely see a situation where there's a military confrontation between Israel and Turkey, designed by Turkey, instigated by Turkey, in order to have an excuse and in part of a Turkish expansionist attempt to take control over the region. So Turkey is hostile, negative, supports terror organizations, supports the Muslim Brotherhood, facilitates a lot of very negative things towards Europe, but specifically in my area of the world, towards Israel. And I can only regret that the Turkish government regime is cozy and on good terms with the American administration. I think that's a very significant mistake by the American administration, and I only wish that they would reconsider, recalibrate, and understand that the Turkey under Erdogan is not a positive force.
Right.
Yeah, we have to move on to the Amnesty report. As of late, recently, Amnesty published this here report called Targeting Civilians, Murder, Hostage Taking, and Other Violations by Palestinian Armed Groups in Israel and Gaza. And Amnesty has been criticized by this, also by me and a lot of other people, for not publishing this report. I had on Dr. Yariv Muhar, who was high up in the system of the Israel chapter of Amnesty, talking about how their office was in effect closed down by Amnesty head office because they refused to parrot these genocide libels of towards Israel. So they were closed down, and also he was criticizing how they've been sitting on this report ever since October 7th and not wanting to publish it because it could actually tilt the narrative in favor of Israel or create more understanding for Israel. And as we all know, Amnesty actually published a report on Gaza, calling it a genocide, concluding on genocide even before the international criminal courts and everything, just around a year after October 7th. And then this comes out 26 months after October 7th. So, Jonathan, what are your thoughts about this whole report from Amnesty International?
Yeah, it's the levels of cynicism, they are just through the roof. Amnesty is an organization that claims to be impartial and to fight for human rights worldwide. It's based in Britain, has a budget of, I think, around 320 million pounds, has offices worldwide, and still, sadly, enjoys international standing and legitimacy as a non-governmental so-called humanitarian organization. I believe it is corrupt. I believe it serves, in my part of the world, it serves a Palestinian anti-Israeli agenda. There are statements by the head of Amnesty USA and other seniors in Amnesty, documented online, and viewers can look it up with very easy searches, where senior people at Amnesty have even been quoted saying that they have issue and they oppose to the fact that Israel is a Jewish state. It goes as deep as that. I think his name is O'Brien, that's senior.
Yeah.
And Amnesty is an organization that for many years has been part of a very well-coordinated network of so-called humanitarian organizations that are campaigning against Israel, that are operating in a coordinated way using buzzwords and humanitarian talk in order to delegitimize Israel, in order to undermine Israel's standing, international standing, legal standing, in order to expose Israeli leaders and soldiers to judicial warfare, lawfare against them, and basically in order to prevent Israel from having the ability to protect itself and eventually to exist. And I'm not going, this isn't an exaggeration. That is the scope of what Amnesty is part of doing. They've issued, the first report that Amnesty issued regards to Gaza, when they mentioned genocide, was in December 23. December 23, they issued reports, I just checked it out on their website, speaking about genocide. And part of that, even before proceedings were initiated by South Africa against Israel. South Africa, by the way, paid for by Iran and with a lot of backdoor incentives from Iran to South Africa so that South Africa would make that allegation against Israel. But even before that, Amnesty was part of that network that created, again, their international standing, used their international standing against Israel. So it's an organization that has a track record of, proven bias against Israel, systemic institutional bias against Israel. And the fact that, as you say so correctly, it took them 26 months to issue a conclusive report, which is based on not a lot of primary sources, but they did some interviews and looked at videos, etc. And at least they're able to say that, oh yes, Hamas killed mostly civilians on October 7. That was their intent, and Hamas abducted the civilians, and they conducted war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that they even did torture and abuse and many other things. News to exactly no one. And about 2 years too late, of course, when all of this was, public knowledge and clearly available before, and a drop in the ocean and totally at an irrelevant time. I think it's more of a fig leaf, an attempt by Amnesty to say that, look, this is a report that we published and it says, critical things of Hamas. But as you say very correctly, Leif, timing matters. And if this report had come a month after October 7, then it would have been relevant to the discussion. When it comes 2 years, almost 2.5 years after, it isn't really relevant. And it's, of course, part of the whole very cynical political process. I went through the report, not very interesting. Some of it was, a little bit graphic, and they say themselves in the beginning that they struggled to have cooperation with Israelis. They didn't say why, but I can give you my assessment of why: because nobody trusts them. Nobody believes in Amnesty in Israel. Nobody thinks that giving them testimony will be reflected in a fair and unbalanced and an impartial way in the reports. And Israelis have seen how horrible, how hypocritical Amnesty has been over the years, and specifically since October the 7th. And therefore, not a lot of people wanted to cooperate with Amnesty. Last thing, I think that when I look at the introduction there, they write, first paragraph is bottom line about what Hamas, and then second paragraph, of course, how could they not? They speak about Israeli violations, and they speak about Israeli genocide. They say Israeli genocide and apartheid, two slogans and buzzwords that are part of the Palestinian legal lawfare against Israel, two words that have been hijacked, gutted of their original meaning, and weaponized against Israel in a very untruthful way. And genocide is something that, it's a call sign, it's a dog whistle, it's a slogan that the entire pro-Hamas, anti-Israeli camp is using it falsely, when in fact the only genocidal intent in this conflict has been of Hamas against Israel. Israel has no genocidal intent, and Israel has not taken genocidal actions against Palestinians. Israel has fought a war against Hamas, and has fought so with one hand, at least one hand, tied behind his back, and with an attempt, perhaps not always purpose, but with an attempt to fight according to international humanitarian law, which is very far from anything you could say about Hamas. So, to summarize, too little, too late, a fig leaf which is transparent, and it really shines through, and it's really clear what Amnesty is about. It is a tool, an international NGO that still sadly has some international standing, that is part of lawfare and legitimacy fighting against Israel. And I think that their reporting is irrelevant, untruthful, and biased.
I think you're muted, Leif. If you try again, I will press unmute on your mic. Let's see here.
Okay, am I back?
Now we can hear you again. If you repeat the question.
So there seems to be a general trend here with these NGOs, but also the UN organizations, that they have relied a lot on sort of the capital of trust that they've built over the years, based in large part, some on their track records, but also in large part on sort of their mission, right? And they're so shocked and they're so surprised, and this also goes for the press, when Israelis do not want to cooperate with them, and they don't seem to understand or even take seriously the fact that Israelis may have a reason to distrust them. They think that they're beyond, any kind of criticism, any kind of reproach, any kind of suspicion. And we seem to have very different views of what's going on based on your standing. So, in Norway and Sweden and other places, we look at things in a certain way and through a filter that is a little sort of self-righteous, a little naive, I think, in some ways, but distrustful in the other. Whereas in Israel, and I imagine this is the case also for Palestinians and Jordanians, the Lebanese, they're like, listen, we live in a world where real things happen independently of what these organizations wish for the way to be. And does that strike you when you're having conversations with people in sort of the Western world and then see how things happen in the Middle East, and also based on your very extensive history and experience with real life events as they've unfolded, both in diplomatic circles and on the battlefield?
I grew up in Sweden, so I was educated along the lines that you just said and described very clearly. I grew up trusting and even admiring these organizations, the UN, international humanitarian organizations, the Red Cross, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and many other organizations, which in Sweden they're revered, sometimes idolized and really worshipped. I think the average Scandinavian will say, well, these organizations, they can't do anything wrong. They are impartial, non-governmental organizations. They're humanitarians. They're there to do good for humanity. And it's a very naive perspective, which sadly, from my perspective, what I see is a weaponized and hijacked system. And I'd refer our viewers and listeners to a very interesting report issued by an Israeli NGO called NGO Monitor. And they took documents that the IDF obtained in Gaza, and the IDF then declassified these documents and gave them to NGO Monitor, which then analyzed these source documents. And what comes out is a picture of institutional supervision by Hamas over international NGOs that operate in and out of Gaza, where they basically have a similar system to a mafia system, where they identify different people in the organizations, blackmail and extort them, and apply pressure on them so that the organization, different humanitarian organizations active in Gaza, will do things in accordance with what Hamas wants. Now, there wasn't information about Amnesty or some of the other big organizations. I looked and I wanted to share that ahead of this interview, but the report didn't find that, so I won't say it. But I'll say that there's ample evidence of deep institutional ties, corruption between Hamas and Islamic Jihad and UNRWA. That's, of course, not news. We have about 1,500 Hamas and Islamic Jihad members who are also members of UNRWA, paid members, some of them very senior. We have in Lebanon, the head of the teachers union for UNRWA was an active Hamas member, a senior active Hamas member, and this was documented by UN Watch. And if people want to go deeper and learn more about the details, NGO Monitor about the situation in Gaza, UN Watch issued a very comprehensive analysis of ties between UNRWA and Hamas globally. And you can go in and check those out and read in the details. But the situation is one, what I see in my perspective, is of a corrupted system, where it is, from an Israeli perspective, I think impossible today to look at the different organizations and to name even one righteous organization that has stayed true to its cause being to remain impartial and to judge and report on situations from a factual, impartial perspective and actually do humanitarian work. All of the organizations at different levels are corrupted. Human Rights Watch, I know of people who worked in that organization who became disillusioned with the corruption and the complete adoption of the pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian narrative in that organization, with the fixation against Israel, almost pathological fixation against Israel, and decided to be whistleblowers, exposed internal documents, and it's an appalling situation. You have UN rapporteurs, Francesca Albanese, who today I think you could call her the spokesperson for Hamas, or the UN spokesperson for Hamas. She seems to be completely pathologically fixated on Israel. And even today, she has become so extreme that even European countries, even Italy, her home country, says that it doesn't support her anymore, it doesn't agree with what she says and how she says it, and that she is way beyond her mandate as a special rapporteur for the UN. So what's dangerous here is that the entire region is losing trust in the UN system. There's an erosion and a depreciation in the value, the symbolic value that is attached to different non-governmental organizations. First and foremost, the UN, but all of the so-called humanitarians. And the bigger process here is, of course, that Palestinians, pro-Palestinians, pro-Hamas, and many others, and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, years ago, 20, 30 years ago, they identified this entire ecosystem of so-called humanitarian organizations and said, okay, this is where we are going to infiltrate. We are going to work bottom up, and we are going to shape the narrative using these organizations as our Trojan horses. And we are going to use their legitimacy, their prestige, and the fact that people around the world, blonde people with blue eyes and people who live in the US and elsewhere, they still think that these organizations are real and uncorrupt, when in fact the situation is that many of them, perhaps not all, but many of them have undergone a process of radicalization, of very extremely progressive rhetoric, and they have deviated long away from their core mission of impartiality, neutrality, and factual representation of what is going on the ground. And they're serving very extremist agendas. In my case, it's all anti-Israeli, but it's also in many places anti-Western, anti-UK, anti-US, anti-EU when it comes to illegal migration, for instance. You have these humanitarian organizations that will bend over backwards and forcing the EU to accept people into their country that are arriving there illegally. And these are the same organizations.
You know, later today, Jonathan, I'm having the director of Amnesty International here in Norway, John Peter Egenes, his name, and I'm going to challenge him on all of this stuff. And you know what makes me wonder is that if these organizations are really pro-human life, and especially also the more outright pro-Palestinian organizations are actually fighting for the lives of the civilians, where are their voices? Where are they now that IDF has pulled out of Gaza? And what we're seeing is that Hamas is dragging innocent civilian Gazans out into the street, torturing them, beating them, killing them for daring to speak up or daring to actually demonstrate against Hamas or being critical of Hamas. That's what we're seeing now. Where are all these organizations and all these voices now that they are being killed by Hamas?
Well, I think they're busy. They're busy writing reports against Israel. They're busy counting, making allegations about famine and trying to build bigger dossiers and files against Israel on allegations of genocide and many other things. They're busy speaking about what they call settler violence in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. They're busy focusing on the Israeli government. They're busy on many other things, but they're not busy on reflecting on suffering in Gaza perpetrated by Hamas. If they're reflecting on the situation in Gaza, they'll go and focus on those poor, unfortunate Palestinians who are not affiliated with Hamas and they're forced to live in tents and temporary housing, and they're suffering. And I'm sure these organizations will focus their attention on them and, of course, not blame Hamas for it, who started the war and used these people as human shields, but of course blaming Israel. So they're busy doing other things according with their worldview and their narrative, which is a black and white binary narrative: Israel bad, Palestinians good, Hamas is Palestinian, therefore it cannot be capable of doing something bad, and therefore criticism should be focused on Israel, no matter what the situation on the ground is.
Yeah, Leif, do you have a final question for Jonathan before we let him go? We promised him 30 minutes, so we're already on
We're way over time. Yeah,
time.
yeah. And this is really helpful. I think that what I'm sort of reflecting as I'm listening to this is that it seems to me that a lot of these organizations, their credibility is very gradually eroding, also in the West, because more and more things are making less and less sense, and people are less inclined. I mean, thoughtful, open, critically minded people are less inclined to unreservedly give them their support. They're more open to these kinds of questions. They're seeing the chink in the armor, and it leads to a huge crisis, because we actually need institutions like that. Their purpose is very good, and so the fact that they've been infiltrated, I would say, by certain political forces that insist on seeing the world in only one way is a real tragedy for everybody, for them, but most of us for the societies that they're supposed to serve.
Exactly, and for the people who actually need them, for actual refugees in the world, for actual people that are undergoing ethnic cleansing, torture, violence, terrorism, and sadly around the world, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America, there's a lot of that going on. And when international institutions are eroded and corrupted from within, yes, then it leaves them with less capacity to actually do their work. You look at UNRWA, which uses and abuses their UN affiliation, perhaps in the worst and the most atrocious way. You look at that organization, it became many years ago a front organization for Hamas and an enabler for Hamas. Without UNRWA's active participation in the governance of Gaza and the coordination between UNRWA and Hamas, Hamas would not have been able to divert 90% of its resources to fighting against Israel. And UNRWA enabled that, and UNRWA knew what they were enabling. UNRWA worked hand in hand with Hamas in facilitating the oppressive rule of a terrorist organization, an Islamist Sharia-based terrorist organization, over about 2 million Palestinians. That in itself is an atrocity. And who did that? An organization that is funded by UN member states, which today is in trouble. And there are many countries, Sweden included, that have shown moral courage and say, well, no, we're not going to keep funding this organization. For the first time in ever, there were, I think, 7 or 8 European countries who abstained in the vote of renewing the mandate of UNRWA, which is one step short of what they should have done. They should have said, no, this organization must go because it is corrupt, because it is a disgrace to the UN, because it disgraces the symbol of the UN, because it depreciates the value of UN, the UN system and UN symbols. And it is a danger to the entire system, because when you have organizations like this, which are corrupt and horrible, and they use the UN emblem, that reflects on the entire UN system, and then people who really will need the services of UNDP and UNHCR and UNICEF and many other World Health Program and many other things, they won't have the same level of support because it's been hijacked and then support has been eroded. So it's a very dangerous circle. It's a slippery slide, which, you know, we probably don't have time to go into it, but having served inside the UN system for 3 years, desperate, deep, gut renovations are needed in that entire system. It's become bloated. It's a whale. It's a colossus of a bureaucracy, and it's been hijacked by very extreme ideologies, some parts more than others. But at the end of the day, bottom line, most UN organizations are failing in their mission. And in the Middle East, I think the situation is the worst of all regions in the world, where UN organizations and international NGOs are failing in their mission and doing people who need them a disservice.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan. I'd love to have you on the show several times to go into that about
Thank you.
UN and everything. So thank you. And to say again, you're a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Could you just say a little bit about that before you leave, what it is and what you're doing there?
Yeah. Again, thanks for having me on. Always a pleasure. I'm a senior fellow there. FDD is an American think tank that is privately funded, not a single dollar from any government, not the US, not the Israeli, no government funds FDD, which may sound obvious, but that is not the case with most other American think tanks. A lot of foreign funding and a lot of meddling, not at FDD. It is an organization that focuses on US strategic interest, US national security, foreign policy. It has a motto. The slogan is, "We do harm to the enemies of democracy." Countries like Russia, China, Iran, terror organizations around the world, they are the primary target of FDD. We're a relatively small-sized American think tank based in DC. About 100 experts are there. Very good people from diverse backgrounds. We have Christians, Jews, Muslims, Coptics, Sunnis, Lebanese, Israelis, Americans, Canadians, Russians, Turks, from many different nationalities. And I'm very happy to be part of that organization. Tremendous work. And the aim here is to protect democracies that are fighting against evil forces. That's the bottom line.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you for your fight against evil forces and for enlightening us here. And we wish you a great weekend and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Shalom. Same to you and to your families. Thank you.
Take care.
You. Ok, det var Jonathan Conricus som var med oss. Da bytter vi over til norsk. Og skulle vi ha oppsummert litt grann, Leif, til de som ikke er så kyndige i engelsk, som kanskje gjerne ville visst dette litt mer på norsk. Hvordan skulle vi oppsummert hva Conricus sa?
Ja, det var jo veldig innholdsrikt. Men sånn veldig oppsummert da, så påpekte han at krigen ikke ferdig i og omkring Israel, for det ikke kommet gode politiske løsninger. Og det ser heller ikke ut som det blir gode politiske løsninger med mindre det følges opp med trusselen om eller ordentlig eller bruk av militærmakt. Så derfor så det Israel noe motvillig, men nå med mindre illusjoner om før, har en veldig aktiv holdning både overfor Syria og Libanon, og også potensielt mot Gaza. Og når det gjelder Amnesty, så påpekte han at det et systemisk problem for alle disse NGOs, og også FN, at de blitt kuppet og overtatt av radikale krefter. Han snakket veldig mye om denne politiske islamistsiden, for egen regning for å si også jeg tror det krøpende et sånt verdenssyn som går ut veldig mye på at Vesten alltid ond, og det som den tredje verden, eller hva de nå kalles, altså tidligere koloniserte områder alltid skal være som offre. Og at dette på en måte gjennomsyrer tankegangen, at de har blitt korrupte også på grunn av pengestrøm som kommet fra andre land da, som det dreier seg om. Og så påpekte han at det i ferd med å være maktforskyvning rundt Middelhavet, at Tyrkia har imperialistiske ambisjoner, og innstilt på å legge militærmakt og etterretningsmakt og alle andre ting for å dominere, og da ser de på Israel som hovedrivalen. Så jeg må jo si, jeg har begynt å legge merke til dette jeg også, at det fremdeles veldig mye urolig, og det ikke tegn til at dette løser seg på snarlig måte, i hvert fall ikke gjennom den type forhandlinger som vi kanskje skulle ønske at det var da. Så jeg tror vi har en liten pause nå, og så kommer det til å begynne å skje ting etter hvert.
Stille for stormen.
Ja, kanskje det ikke blir en så stor storm som det var i krigen mot Iran, men at det blir det lengre og mer kompliserte konflikter, og at Israel ikke kommer til å gi seg uansett, at nå tålmodigheten over, nå har ikke bare israelske ledere, men det israelske publikum har mistet troen på at dette med å liksom skyve problemet foran seg, at det har noe for seg lenger. Nå det appetitt for å få dette avklart, og det gjør jo selvfølgelig Israels fiender nervøse, for de har alltid satset på at de får, hvis de taper en kamp, så får de en ny mulighet noen år senere. Og det ser ikke ut som det interesse for. Det ikke politisk interesse for det i Israel. Og så det uenighet om masse annet, det som hva som riktig fremgangsmåte, og hvem som egentlig fiendene, og hvordan de ulike fiendene skal håndteres. Men jeg tror det en sånn gjennomgående sak nå.
Men hvis det interesse der ute for å støtte dette arbeidet med denne podcasten og arbeidet vi gjør her, så kan man støtte arbeidet på VIPS nummer 82 32 78. Det var VIPS nummer 82 32 78. Og da kan man bidra med stort eller smått, og det man har å vipse for å bidra til dette her det ikke noe statsstøtte eller noe tilsvarende eller noe pressestøtte, så bidra gjerne med det du har lyst eller mulighet til. Jeg skal som sagt, som nevnt, møte Jon Peder Egernes, generalsekretær i Amnesty Norge nå klokken 1, så jeg må nesten forberede meg litt grann til det, men det noen presserende saker som vi burde bare nevne kort denne uka her, Leif, et eller annet på tampen som vi burde ta før vi avrunder?
Ja, det alltid ulike ting da. Det jo det Nobelbråk eller kontroversen rundt Nobelprisutdelingen som jeg tror relevant for det vi pleier å snakke om. Vi kan ta det en annen gang. Men det forteller litt grann om politisk miljø i Norge. Det som jeg vil nevne helt til slutt, det jo at delstaten Florida har jo vedtatt boykott mot norske universiteter.
Ja, fortell hva det handler om, hvorfor ble det sånn?
Ja, fordi de har jo da, det jo en lov de faktisk har innført i delstaten om at det forbudt for institusjoner å boykotte Israel. Og at de som boykotter Israel, de skal selv møtes med boykott. Og det liksom varierende tiltak mot dette her, men av dem at det en rekke norske universiteter da satt på Floridas boykottlister, og det har ikke så mye praktisk effekt, men det jo fordi at jeg vet ikke hvor mye de universitetene har faktisk med Florida å gjøre, men det jo et mottiltak da. Det de norske universitetene sier at de boykotter ikke Israel, de har bare avsluttet all samarbeid med Israel, som om det en stor forskjell, og så klager de over hvilken trussel dette her mot akademisk frihet. Nå synes ikke jeg at Florida skal boykotte norske universiteter, jeg synes ikke at en urett rettferdiggjør en annen urett, men det jo litt merkelig å høre hvordan de klager over at det andre gjør, når andre gjør mot dem, det de gjør mot andre, plutselig stiller ting i et helt annet lys, så de litt... Det en del prinsippløshet her, men det jeg forstår av diskusjonen internt i disse norske universitetene, at det dreier seg ikke om en prinsipiell sak i det hele tatt. Det dreier seg om at de vil slippe å ha bråk fra et lite knippe, høylytte og aldeles uforsonlige aktivister innenfor sitt akademiske miljø, både fakultet og studenter, som bare ikke vil gi seg under noen omstendigheter på at Israel må for all del boykottes. Og det setter jo dem i en stadig vanskelig situasjon, og så har de ikke, som vi også var litt sånn innom Jonathan, ikke sant? Så har vi ikke ledere som tøffe å si at nei, her må vi jobbe prinsipielt, og ikke bare la oss styre av en politisk sak. Det samme gjelder jo med Eurovision Song Contest, ikke sant? Det de samme som skriker og forteller at hvis man ikke vil boykotte, hvis man ikke vil være mot Israel i absolutt alle mulige sammenhenger, så man et dårlig menneske. Og de vinner frem med denne argumentasjonen. Åpenbart så funker det veldig godt. Det tragisk.
Jeg synes det bra at Florida boykotter, for da ser vi at det faktisk har en effekt det vi driver med her i Norge, at det får konsekvenser. Og en person som også veldig glad for dette jo Torkel Brekke, som tidligere var det i fjor han skrev en opped i Wall Street Journal, hvor han kalte på «Please boycott my country». Så endelig så får vi også en boykott her i Norge, og jeg synes det på sin plass, fordi da ser vi at vi kan ikke bare agere akkurat sånn som vi vil. Det får faktisk real world consequences, det vi driver med.
Ja, jeg ser den. Men jeg tror likevel at det viktigere å ivareta utveksling av kunnskap
ja, det også viktig,
selvfølgelig. Og forskningsinstitusjoner. Men som sagt, dette veldig mye sånn symbolpolitikk, for jeg vet ikke hvor mye det har praktisk å si for noen av disse her, at de ikke kan utveksle studenter mellom Norge og Florida det påvirker noen få, og det fremdeles ikke noe hinder for at fakultet kan ha studieopphold på det ene eller stedet eller det andre. Men det er jo nettopp det som problemet, ikke sant? At de kaster akademisk frihet, og de kaster kunnskapsutveksling til ulvene for å liksom statuere et sånt egentlig et billig og banalt politisk poeng, som overhodet ikke hjelper noen i Midtøsten eller noe sted. Tvert imot så skader det jo, ikke sant, det radikaliserer konflikten enda mer, og det er jo de samme personene som går igjen hele tiden, hvor de da fordømmer deres meningsmotstandere som dumme eller slemme. Du var jo utsatt for det på Facebook, ikke sant, hvor du uttrykte noen ting om de avsløringene som var kommet i det siste, og Sindre Bangstad sa at ja, nei, nå kan du bli strafferettslig forfulgt fordi du har den meningen. Altså, det er jo, ikke sant, dette er jo sånn som fascister sier, altså han burde virkelig ta en runde med seg selv hvis han kommer med den argumentasjonen. Men det er vanlig da, jeg ser det hele tiden. Han er en av de mest bråkete fyren, mye fordi at han får fritt spillerom på Kronos sider, uansett hva han skriver, så det visst bra nok til å publiseres der. Men det er typisk for egentlig en ganske liten gruppe som lager veldig mye støy og helt uforståelig, ikke godta at noen mener noe annet enn det de mener riktig. Og det er
kateterprofeter. Det er kateterprofeter. Jeg hadde faktisk forfatteren kateterprofeter, han Harhaug, som var her innom i går, Andreas Harhaug Olsen, og det handler jo om da nettopp akademikere som har blitt moralsk overbevist om at de har den eneretten på sannheten, og de sitter på den store sannheten og er nødt til å belære folk om den. Det er ikke nok å belære folk om kunnskap og objektive sannheter, men du skal også fortelle hva som den riktige moralske overbevisningen og den riktige ideologien å ha. Så det kan jeg også anbefale å lese den boka Kateterprofetene. Den episoden kommer snart ut, og kanskje i løpet av helgen. Men jeg må dessverre runde av fra min side her. Jeg skal jo få han Amnesty-sjefen inn i studio og grille han litt, så det blir barbecue-stemning her i studio etterpå. Og det passer jo bra, siden vi går inn mot helgen. Så da ønsker jeg alle sammen en riktig god fredag og god helg, og Shabbat Shalom til dem som på den siden av saken. Og ikke minst ikke minst så det jo Hanukka også etter hvert nå. Skal vi si noe kjapt om det før vi runder av?
Ja, det begynner vel søndag kveld. Det jo en sånn vits om at jøder alltid usikre på når Hanukka begynner, men det søndag kveld. Det varer 8 dager. Vi tenner et lys. Vi tenner et lys for å tenne et lys første dag, og så tenner vi et lys for å tenne 2 lys andre dag, og så videre, helt til det 8 dager da. Så da avsluttes søndag kveld om den 21. Det en høytid som markerer, som fortolkes på litt som forskjellige måter, men grunnen til at vi tenner lys som til minne om vi kaller det et mirakel, men det hebraiske ordet betyr egentlig tegn, og det var at oljen i tempelet greide å holdt flammen opp i 8 dager, og det ble betraktet som da de gjeninnviet tempelet etter at det var blitt ødelagt. Og jeg fortolker det, min egen fortolkning at det en høytid for å minnes retten til å være annerledes. At alle mennesker har rett til å være annerledes, og fra det som normen i storsamfunnet. Og det annerledes på mange måter, altså så jøder har rett til å være annerledes, men det har også alle andre grupper. Så jeg mener det en høytid med universal appell. Og så det estetisk veldig vakkert når man stadig tenner lys, og det blir flere og flere lys. Og det skal gjøres offentlig, lysene skal stå offentlig, hvis det mulig å få det til. Men det andre fortolkninger også, det får vi ta en annen gang. Ja.
Veldig fin måte å avslutte på, så ser jeg at folk skriver de gleder seg til klokka 13. Jeg vil bare si at det ikke live den sendingen med Amnesty, så det ikke her klokken 13, det blir opptak fysisk i studio, og så kommer det ut antagelig ganske snart, sikkert enten i dag eller i løpet av helgen. Så der Embla skriver vi gleder oss til grillparty av Amnesty. Ja, men det gjør jeg også, og da får dere se på den episoden, og jeg skal være høflig altså, men jeg skal grille ham med ordentlige spørsmål.
Ja, du gjør jo det, du sånn som skriker til meningsmotstandere, du lar noe få snakke ut. Det jo...
Da kommer de aldri på besøk igjen, vet du.
Nei, men det
greit å holde det bærekraftig.
Ja, det helt sikkert. Det veldig bra.
Men takk for i dag, alle sammen. Riktig god helg, og Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, ja.